Story 1. I'd like to say, as a history teacher, I always tell my students not to make heroes out of historical figures. We should celebrate the accomplishments and deeds of many of the people mentioned in this thread, but that does not mean we need to pretend they were incapable of terrible actions. Thomas Jefferson does not need to be deified. We should be honest and teach about his role as an enslaver and a rapist, his promotion of genocide against Native Americans, and his contempt for working-class Americans. All of this occurred at a time when many contemporaries pointed out his contradictions. But the Declaration of Independence and his role in helping secure that independence shaped the American ideal of freedom and equality. It gave abolitionists ideological cover to ground their arguments in the fabric of the nation. That deserves to be recognized. His good deeds do not make him a good person. Let us celebrate the deeds while being honest about the man. Story 2. King Edward VIII is often said to have given up the throne to marry the woman he loved. In reality, he love-bombed Wallis Simpson, pressured her into a relationship, repeatedly harassed her, ignored her requests to stop, and pursued her despite the fact that she was married when they met. He was also strongly pro-German. During his brief reign, he suggested that Britain should yield to Germany's demands to preserve peace. He advised Nazi commanders that if they continued bombing London, the British would eventually capitulate, and he toured a Schutzstaffel training camp and an early concentration camp. Story 3. Susan B. Anthony. She is known as the hero of women's suffrage, but she had a large role in ending the American Equal Rights Association in 1869 and arguably helped delay women's suffrage for decades. She and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were bitter that black men were getting the vote before white women, and they not only ended cooperation between women and black men but also split the women's suffrage movement into two organizations: the American Woman Suffrage Association, which supported the 15th Amendment, and the National Woman Suffrage Association, which opposed it. There is no way to measure how badly this split damaged the movement, but shedding allies never helps a cause. Edited to add, because some responses argued that black men were being sexist and that Anthony was a victim of sexism, the following is a quote from her, said during the final American Equal Rights Association meeting. The old anti-slavery school says women must stand back and wait until the Negroes shall be recognized. But we say, if you will not give the whole loaf of suffrage to the entire people, give it to the most intelligent first. If intelligence, justice, and morality are to have precedence in the government, let the question of the woman be brought up first and that of the Negro last. Story 4. Some people may argue that Joseph Smith is relevant only to a certain group. We sang songs praising him along with Jesus and God, only to discover that he was a manipulative pervert and con man. Story 5. Reading through the thread. So yeah, just everyone, huh? Story 6. Woodrow Wilson. For years I thought of him as the president who tried to prevent future wars by creating the League of Nations, only to be undercut by nativist forces that kept the United States out of it and made the League ineffective. It turns out he was an outspoken racist, a sympathizer with the Ku Klux Klan, and resegregated the federal workforce. Story 7. I discovered that the man who killed Hitler was behind all of it. Story 8. King Richard the Lionheart. An absolute wanker. He spent all his time and most of the kingdom's money fighting the Crusades and trying to conquer Jerusalem, only to turn back twice when he had the opportunity. He was captured and ransomed. Then he became close friends with his former sworn enemy and tried to force his sister to marry him. Meanwhile, back in England, who was trying to hold things together while paying Richard's bills and ransom, his brother, Prince John. If this sounds familiar, it is because this is the same Prince John who serves as the villain in Robin Hood. Story 9. Henry Ford. We learned that he may or may not have invented the assembly line and helped make cars accessible to average Americans. They omitted that he was ruthless, exploitative, and sympathetic to the Nazis. Story 10. As an English person, I was taught about Oliver Cromwell in school. We learned that he led the country in our only experiment with being a republic. He had strict views on mince pies, but he was generally regarded as being on the right side of the English Civil War, opposing a king who was overreaching his authority. When I became friends with an Irish person, I learned the Irish have a very different, and entirely justified view of Cromwell. They see him as a brutal oppressor, comparable to Hitler. Shout out to Columbus, who appears in the more morally neutral, the Americas were discovered version of history, but there are crucial surrounding facts it would have been good to know. Story 11. This is not a video game joke about nuclear weapons. We were taught that Mahatma Gandhi was a good nonviolent leader of civil disobedience, but he was abusive toward his family and predatory toward young women. Story 12. James Madison, a founding father and the fourth president of the United States of America and the primary author of the Constitution, owned slaves. His father also owned slaves. Madison's father raped one of his slaves, producing a child who was Madison's half-sister. James Madison later raped his half-sister, impregnating her. She bore a child who was both Madison's son and his nephew. Madison later sold that child after the child fell in love with a white woman. Story 13. I didn't know whether Erwin Schrödinger was good or bad until I watched a short documentary about him. Now I know. Story 14. In elementary school, he was portrayed as a brave explorer who discovered America. But what they did not tell you was that he was a genocidal maniac who enslaved, tortured, and slaughtered indigenous people. He was later recalled to Spain in chains because he was considered too brutal, even by the standards of 16th century colonizers. The fact that we had a national holiday for him and sang songs about him in school is disgusting. Story 15. Thomas Edison was a patent pirate who took credit for other people's inventions and claimed he had invented them. Story 16. The damage the lost cause narrative has caused American society is still being addressed today. Story 17. Christopher Columbus went from being presented as he discovered America in second grade to being described as a genocidal maniac in college. My history teacher really did us dirty with that one. Story 18. I grew up in a very red community and parish in the state of Louisiana. Therefore, my answer has been and always will be Ronald Reagan. They treated him like a god, and as a young child who only knew people in my community, I believed them. Story 19. I grew up in Dixie, so in elementary and middle school I was taught that Robert E. Lee and his followers were vaguely on the right side until I moved to a different high school. Story 20. Al Capone. But that one was on me. My granddad lived in Chicago when Capone ran the city and told me stories. I was a tiny little 4-year-old girl who wanted nothing more than to grow up to be the next Al Capone. I idolized the fear he instilled in a city until I was old enough to understand it. I still find my small, bloodthirsty self hilarious. I also hated being treated like a child. I got very sharp with restaurant staff who asked if I wanted a children's menu and crayons. Server: "Ah, you're so cute. Do you want some crayons with your kids' menu?" Me, in pigtails, glowering at them like they had killed a puppy in front of me. "I'm not a child. I need an adult menu." My grandfather proudly. She'd look the devil in the eye and dare him to spit fire. I miss him and my grandmother. They were the best. Story 21. Rose Kennedy. My Irish mother thought these people and their whole empire were the bomb, who forced their child to undergo a lobotomy and then shut her away in an institution 2,000 miles away, preventing her from seeing her family for decades, or excommunicated their other daughter, only for her to die in a plane crash in Europe while they refused to attend her funeral? Monster. The story of Kit's death reminds me so much of John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr.'s end. Story 22. As an American, when you are little they basically present it like this. The Pilgrims showed up hungry and the Native Americans gave them food. Everyone had a nice meal, and that is where we got Thanksgiving. Yes, the Native Americans did help, but the Puritans quickly turned against them. Also, I had no idea for a long time that Christopher Columbus was a rapist and a murderer. Story 23. Churchill was not entirely a villain, but he is given a lot of latitude because of his success in World War II. The Bengal famine and Gallipoli are two significant failures that tend to be overlooked. Story 24. A bit more obscure. I remember learning that Trotsky was the good communist leader who was deposed and killed by the evil Stalin. Turns out they were both pieces of shit. Story 25. I am French. While I do not recall Napoleon being presented as a good guy, I learned that he was a very competent leader and a man who did a lot to help the country. He was still a dictator with his own interests in mind, but he made the country powerful. Then you learn what the rest of Europe thinks of him, which is often much less favorable. Story 26. Oliver Cromwell. In England, I was taught in the 1990s that he was a leader who stood up to the tyrannical rule of the king and ousted him during the English Civil War by beheading King Charles. I am sure the Irish would have an incredibly different view of him. Story 27. King Richard the Lionheart is too often portrayed as an amazing king and leader of England, but he hated England. Story 28. When you reach your 30s, you realize there is no such thing as a good guy. Story 29. It turns out that most of the colonizers and explorers who settled Australia, as we learned in school, were the bad guys. They committed genocide against First Nations people, participated in the slave trade, and removed children from their families. Story 30. Let me preface by saying I live in Chicago. People worship Michael Jordan and still do. He left a blueprint for ignorance among the youth here. As long as you are talented at basketball, none of the other things you do matter. You do not have to have empathy or care about others. You do not have to contribute in a meaningful way to the community. Just be talented, keep your mouth shut, and never express an opinion on anything. R. Kelly is again a figure of modern worship. If you want to start a fight in a church, shout that R. Kelly is a pedophile and you may end up fighting with an older man. I assume this is our version of Donald Trump. Story 31. I will not call him a villain, but I was raised to think John F. Kennedy was an exceptionally good man. We know about his affairs, and that is not what I am referring to. The way people talk about him makes it sound like he was adored and won by a landslide. He only won by 0.17%, which is just a little over 100,000 popular votes. He expanded the Central Intelligence Agency's covert operations, including authorizing the overthrow of foreign governments. He escalated the Vietnam War. He increased surveillance of civil rights leaders, activists, journalists, members of Congress, and leftist organizations. He knew they were tapping Martin Luther King Jr.'s phones and, I believe, authorized it. He used the government against political opponents to harass and investigate them. There are actions he took that overlap with those of our current president, though not as severe and much more subtle. Story 32. David from the Bible. What an asshole. He killed a shepherd and kidnapped his wife for refusing to pay extortion. He set up a man to die so he could marry that man's wife. He was not a cool dude. Story 33. Napoleon I. When I first heard about him, I thought he was a great conqueror exporting some of the liberal ideas of the French Revolution to the obsolete, oppressive, absolute monarchies of Europe. Only later did I learn that he reversed many of the revolution's most important advancements, including the abolition of slavery, women's rights, and democratic reforms. He appointed his siblings to the thrones of conquered European nations and removed Josephine de Beauharnais, perhaps the most popular royal and imperial consort France ever had. I acknowledge the last two actions were common in European politics at the time, but neither sat right with me and both worsened my impression of him. Story 34. Buford Pusser of Walking Tall fame is accused of murdering his wife and pinning it on some town residents. Story 35. Oh, so many. Henry Kissinger is probably one of the most evil motherfuckers on that list, though. Story 36. Abraham, you know, the one who was going to kill his son to appease God, the one everyone in church always excuses by saying it was just a test. When I grew up, I realized that if that was just a test, he completely failed. Needless to say, my Christian childhood did not produce a Christian adult. The only appropriate answer to anyone, deity or human, who says, "If you really love me, you will kill your child," is absolutely not. And other words I cannot repeat. Story 37. Aside from Harriet Tubman, most of what I learned about historical figures has been that they were often awful people. Tubman was far more of a badass than I was taught in school. Story 38. Moses. The town of Midian took Moses in as a fugitive after he murdered an Egyptian in Egypt. He married a woman, lived for years in his father-in-law's house, and had children. He later returned to Egypt and led 600,000 Hebrews out of Egypt. On the way to the Promised Land, he ordered his soldiers to massacre the entire town of Midian, sparing only the young female virgins, who were to be given to the soldiers as property. He then remained in the region of Midian while ordering the massacre of all 35 kingdoms in the Promised Land, killing every man, woman, and child. He said it was no longer necessary to spare the young female virgins. This account is disturbing to many readers. Story 39. Christopher Columbus was portrayed in school as a brave explorer who was said to have discovered America. But in reality he enslaved, tortured, and slaughtered indigenous people, and was so brutal that Spain recalled him in chains. He is definitely not the hero we were taught about. Story 40. The Mongols Leonize Genghis Khan. To others, his name is synonymous with barbarity. Story 41. Captain Spaulding. He once shot an elephant in his pajamas. Story 42. I introduce you to the Rommel myth. Story 43. Phineas Taylor Barnum. I always thought he was a great person for bringing circuses to the public. Then I found out how he treated all his performers. Story 44. Che Guevara. Labor camps, executions, homophobia, racism, human rights violations. Story 45. Winston Churchill was a stalwart champion of fighting fascists in Europe, and he did so by severely exploiting every non-white subject of the crown. His policies in India may not have been intended as genocide, but they nonetheless caused millions of deaths from famine alone. Story 46. Churchill gave some good speeches, but he was generally inept, racist, and represented many negative aspects of the Tories. Story 47. That Hitler fellow. The more I hear about him, the less I like him. He seems like a real jerk. Story 48. Churchill was an absolute racist who showed contempt for non-white people. Beloved by British and American people, he was responsible for 2 to 3 million deaths in India during the Bengal famine. Story 49. Based on the comments, it appears to be anyone prominently mentioned in history books. Story 50. Captain James Cook was not a great explorer but a disgusting person who falsely declared land inhabited by a civilization for a minimum of 60,000 years as Terra Nullius, all to advance his own career. Like other so-called great explorers who discovered already occupied land, he paved the way for the invasion, occupation, and colonization of Australia. The harm Cook and people like him did has inflicted irreparable damage on the oldest known civilization on Earth. In school, this entire period of Australian history was whitewashed. We were taught that Cook essentially did them a favor and that it was not that bad, not that many people died. I celebrate February 14th for an entirely different reason. Story 51. Columbus. All through school we were taught how great he was. In college, I read his letters from the expedition and discovered he was a terrible person. Story 52. The American military in general and Hollywood war movies are incredibly successful propaganda. Story 53. Yitzhak Shamir was the former Prime Minister of Israel. My grandmother on my father's side was a member of the Zionist organization Hadassah. My father was not a member and was unsympathetic toward Palestinians. Shamir lost his parents and 2 sisters during the Holocaust. He then proceeded to do to the people of Palestine precisely what was done to our own people at that time. If my father were still alive, I do not know how he would react to the genocide being carried out or whether he would change his mind about the creation of Israel or about its supposed purpose. Story 54. Walter Raleigh is often described as an explorer and royal servant, but he was a slave owner and invader and a mediocre explorer who was primarily obsessed with tobacco. John F. Kennedy was praised as progressive and is often regarded as a martyr in some respects, but he also confined a relative to a mental hospital after she disagreed with other family members who had mob connections. He cheated on his wife, and he was responsible for drawing the United States into the Vietnam War, for which his successors later received much of the blame. Winston Churchill's commitment to fighting fascism in Nazi Germany is undermined by his approval of policies that allowed thousands of people in India to starve during a famine. These last 2 are not necessarily villains compared to their enemies, but they are not admirable people. Mother Teresa has a good reputation but has been accused of cruelty and of allowing people to die. Henry VIII is not considered a good person. He is often treated like a controversial celebrity, but he was a dangerous ruler. His daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, is often praised as a great female leader but was a colonialist who helped develop the slave trade and was racist, believing London had too many black people. The planners of the Canadian railways are praised as builders, but they displaced First Nations people from their land, exposed them to starvation, and hired large numbers of low-paid Chinese immigrant laborers to do most of the work for a pittance. Queen Victoria is often criticized less than her subordinates, but many of the worst abuses were carried out by her servants rather than by her personally. Story 55. Royalty in my country, including the current monarch and the next in line. Story 56. Winston Churchill immediately comes to mind, but of course there is no shortage of great historical figures who were incorrigible sons of bitches. Story 57. Winston Churchill and the Bengal famine. He knew it was happening. They had the resources to feed the people. He specifically chose not to send food, diverting aid shipments from other regional governors and reserving them for the military. Even troops stationed in Bengal shared their rations because they believed the military policy was unjust. Story 58. Ex-Mormon here. Joseph Smith and pretty much all of the prophets. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.